If you heard of the monsoon, you probably heard of the monsoon onset, which is often the most awaited thing as spring commences or spring begins to end and summer commences, especially over India. There are several questions to be addressed there, but we'll try to stick to the relation with MISO. So I like this figure, which is basically showing a pentad precipitation rate, I think from GPCP from the WMO. So it's a latitude time averaged over the Indian region and over the maritime continent, Western Pacific region. And you can clearly see here that in both cases the ITCZ is to the south of the equator when the sun is to the south, maximum heating, convergence, you know, the ITCZ dynamics. As sun crosses over the equator by March, April, you can see that over the maritime continent, and you can do it also to the east over Africa, the ITCZ tends to follow the sun, even though the maritime continent does get some rain during the boreal summer months as well. But the Indian Ocean region is quite different. You can see that the ITCZ wants to cross the equator, but then kind of splits up. As I already said many times, the Indian Ocean is fairly warm, so the marine ITCZ remains and the continental convergence zone gets set up, and then the monsoon withdrawal happens, and then the ITCZ heads back to the southern hemisphere. So you can see here these patches of northward propagation, if you will. So the energy of the convection in the deep tropics is being propagated into the Bay of Bengal over to the subcontinent as MISO's monsoon interseasonal oscillations. But what exactly is the monsoon onset? This is not always a well-defined concept, but I want you to keep in mind that the equatorial crossing and the northward propagation of the convection that we talked about before, northward propagation of these interseasonal oscillations, must have a relation with the monsoon onset. And there is some evidence, paper by Leis-Zoe for example, arguing that a higher northward propagating activity in May tends to correspond to an earlier monsoon onset. But what does an earlier onset mean in terms of seasonal rainfall? Not clear. It's not that early monsoon onset gives you a above normal rainfall, but it generally turns out that late onset often does not result in a wet year. So there must be some relation, but to the extent that we don't know the exact processes and the relations are still open questions. These are the kind of things that the media will put up every year as the IMD begins to make the predictions of onset and the season and so on. So this is looking at monsoon likely to arrive in Kerala on June 5th for 2020. If you remember there was a cyclone before which had arguably advanced the trough to move over to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and this is the normal dates of onset that we expect. So the monsoon trough is arriving northwestward from the and northward from the tropical Pacific, South China Sea, and so on. So there is a monsoon onset that is looked at in many studies by Wedong Yu and his group, for example, over the Bay of Bengal, and the Indian monsoon onset is considered to occur when the rainfall or the trough hits Kerala, and there is a jump in rainfall, as we will see in a minute. And there are reasons to track this because there are evidences over many decades that once the onset happens, there are some predictable northwestward propagation of the monsoon trough, and each region has its own monsoon onset, even though the monsoon season onset is considered to happen when the trough hits Kerala. So you can look at the dates here. For example, 2019 the forecast was June 6th, actual onset happened on June 8th. 2018 was a few days earlier. 2017 was almost on time. 16 was delayed, 15 was delayed, and 21 was also delayed by a couple of days. Okay, so these are the things you have to remember. Sorry, this figure is not so clear, but this is the 2021 figure. Again, there were two cyclones at the end of May. Excuse me. Taukte in the Arabian Sea and Yash in the Bay of Bengal, and they presumably also interacted with the trough. The onset happened officially on June 3rd, I think, and the subsequent evolution of the monsoon this year in 2021 has been a little strange. So far there are large deficits, especially over Gujarat and the northeast. Now in August, mid of August already, normal rainfall is supposed to resume, so whether we will get extremes and then overall countrywide rainfall will become normal and so on are difficult questions. So onset is an interesting feature, and it does have relation with the MISOs, and you can see that here in the figure from Goswami's chapter. It's looking at 1979 here. There was a very strong MISO here propagating northward and rainfall. This is called a bogus onset. Actually the real onset is here. So we are looking here at time latitude section of CMAP, the CPC mapping of precipitation anomalies averaged over 70 to 90 east. Only positive anomalies greater than 2 millimeter per day are shown here to track the onset itself. Northward propagating wet spells can be seen here. The dashed line shows evolution of the total kinetic energy of the winds at 850 hectopascal averaged over the low-level jet. So that's 55 east to 65 east, 5 north, 55 north, which is clearly over the Arabian Sea, where the core of the monsoon low-level jet occurs. Latitude of Kerala, southern tip of India, is shown by the horizontal line here at 10 south, and the monsoon onset over and roughly corresponds to kinetic energy exceeding 100 meter per second squared and precipitation exceeding 4 millimeter per day. So these are kind of empirically set thresholds, but these are the kind of details one has to worry about. So you can see that the onset happened here in 1979, and generally there is not many samples, but still the bogus earlier onset can delay the actual season onset. 1984 here showing that the onset couldn't be identified here very well. So here again we are in a very late onset, but the kinetic energy jumped and rainfall happened at much higher latitude compared to the Kerala rainfall over here. Okay, so one has to be careful about that as well. And 1987, which was the end of the El Nino and one of the back-to-back droughts, 86, 87. Very rare that these things happen. I think only 3 happened in the 20th century. One has happened in the 21st century, 2014, 15. Again, you can see that the kinetic energy jumps, though that definition of onset is met. The rainfall rate over Kerala at this latitude doesn't meet the criterion till much later. So this gives you a sense of taking the dynamics of the low-level jet, which is bringing the moisture onto the subcontinent, and the actual trough moving over and meeting the Kerala latitude, and the rain rates jumping at Kerala to 4 millimeter per day are all kind of very variable from year to year. Nonetheless, there are attempts to forecast onsets, and there is some studies that argue that large-scale dynamics occur much before, and actually we can even, I'm looking at a mosquito over there, sorry, even a season or two ahead, one can predict whether the onset will be early or late, not the actual date, but just whether it'll be earlier than normal or later than normal. There is also some reports published that say that there has been a change in the onset with the climate regime shift that occurred in the mid-1970s. The onset is supposed to have started to occur a few days later than normal, as opposed to pre-1976 when it used to occur a few days before normal, which you can take as June 1st, right? But the inconsistency there, or at least something that has to be explained, is that there is supposed to be now a regime shift in 1998, as seen in some of the same variables that was seen in 1976, so we have gone back. The monsoon onset hasn't gone back. It is possible that global warming modulates the natural variability of the monsoon onset, or that the statistical significance of the onset jumps, etc., have to be looked at much more carefully. So mechanisms not very well known. Tapio Schneider's group does some things about how extratropical eddy fluxes can affect the onset, and Jeff Wallis would talk about the jump in the thermal state forced from the tropics, and relation from the onset to the seasonal amounts is not very well known as well, and just the intraannual variability of the monsoon is not terribly well understood as well. Again, these are important science questions that provide you an idea of where open science questions are in case you wanted to follow up. Okay?